So this is the Salem Common. And when I was a very little girl, I think you remember visiting me on one school holiday, this was actually known as the town swamp. And I think you remember, it was all hills and swampland, and the town poorhouse was over on that corner there. And then it was all tanneries on the other side. So not many of us ventured to the other side of the Salem Common at that time. The local militia would come and drill, but that was about it. And then in 1802, Mr. Elias Haskett Darby Jr., who at that point still had some money and some pretensions of becoming an important gentleman in the town, led I think you call it now, an initiative to grade the town land, put this wrought iron fence up around the town common, and to turn it into a parkland and an appropriate drill field for the Salem militia units. Now at that time, all able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 60 had to drill with the militia. But you had several choices by our time. You could join the regular militia, which was known for not being very well drilled and drinking a lot and showing up half-clad with missing equipment. Or if you were a gentleman of some substance and didn't want to be associated with the sailors and other hoi polloi who would be on in the regular militia units, you could join a company. And at this time, these different companies just exploded all over Massachusetts. And here in Salem, we had quite a number. There was the Washington Rangers that supplied for a couple of years. There was the Essex Guards. But the two that were best known were the Salem Cadets. So this was a cadet corps that was founded in the 1780s, and its purpose was, I believe you now have the Reserve Officers Training Corps. So the idea was that everyone in these cadet units were training as officers, and in wartime they could go and form other militia units and be officers. There was also the Salem Light Infantry, and these units were very expensive to join because you had to buy your uniforms, and they all had gorgeous uniforms, and you had to buy all of your weapons, and of course they had the most expensive weapons that you possibly could have. And then there were usually annual dues for the clubhouse, and I think I would say it was probably about maybe 20% drill, 80% in the clubhouse doing whatever men do in clubhouses. But it was these were as much social societies as they were militia units. But every year we would have our annual muster on the common. You've come down for several of these. Oh, and they were wonderful. We would have all of the units out there polished and shined with their best uniforms on, performing military evolutions. And then around the edges of the common, we would have vendors set up selling everything from gingerbread. Do you remember that woman who did the most wonderful gingerbread? Gingerbread and candies and other types of food, and selling all sorts of things. And we would all come down in our best attire, and we would watch the militia drill, and then afterwards all of the different units would have dinners and balls and all of these sorts of things. And so this really became an annual or even semi-annual, some years, events. They do it every 6 months as opposed to every year. But it also all got caught up. The development of the common, the militia units, all of these get caught up in our political differences in the early years of the 19th century. So it became very quickly that if you were, a Democratic Republican, you would take the Salem Register. You would join a unit like the Salem Light Infantry, and you would generally live around the common because this was a later development. So the majority of these beautiful large houses that were built were owned by families like the Crown and Shields and other folks. The Olivers was another family who tended to be Democratic Republicans. And generally, those folks who were Democratic Republicans had more trade connections with the French because their families were a little bit newer than the older families who had trading connections with the English. So the Federalists connected with the English mercantile establishment and generally supporting Washington and Hamilton, versus the Democratic Republicans who tended to have more of a French bias and supported that terrible Mr. Jefferson. So this area, it really depended on who you were. Because my family was Federalist, I rarely came over here. I didn't socialize with anyone here, and I certainly didn't go to any of the balls that were hosted by the Democratic Republicans. There's actually one very sad story I heard about a young boy who was at Harvard, and he'd been told that there was a party in Salem, and so he came up to Salem, and only to discover that it was and he brought a whole bunch of friends with him, and he came up only to discover that it was a Salem cadet party that was hosted by the Federalist branch of the Salem Cadets, and they all had to turn around and go sadly back to Harvard because they couldn't actually enter the as they said, it was described to me as a cadet angel waving a flaming sword before the doorway. So everything gets caught up in this sort of thing, in this sort of political battles, and so for many years it was like one half of Salem never even recognized the other half existed. We didn't go to their funerals, we didn't go to their weddings, we didn't go to their parties, and it even divided entire families apart. So any questions before we move down to the waterfront? I did also want to mention this house behind you here, this absolutely gorgeous house. This is really one of the last of these great houses to be built in Salem. This is Mr. John Andrews' house. Do you remember him? It wasn't Governor Andrews. Mr. John Andrews is a very strange man. He had been a supercargo for Mr. Elias Haskett Darby in the 1790s. He disappeared to Russia for about 10 years, came back with a massive fortune, built this house, never got married. Very strange man. So, and those of us who had daughters were always a little concerned about him. So I think that was probably part of the issue. But this house, it ended up in the hands of the Safford family, who turned it into quite a happy family home later on in the 19th century. But it really is a gorgeous example of the last of those large Salem mansions that were built here. All right, so we are going to go all the way down to the other end of the